right, for those of you joining, I'm Brian Fanzo, millennial keynote speaker, podcaster, and your host for the rest of the day. Excited for you guys to be joining us. We got lots of questions coming in, and we hope you guys keep bringing us those questions. Make sure you post them on the social channels as well as here in the feed. If you've been watching us, we kind of pull those questions in to the conversation, hopefully allow you to participate in what we have going on. And I'm kind of just going to jump directly in to our next presentation. We have Joe Federer, the ex-head of strategy at Reddit, an author and a social media strategist. Joe has built Reddit's brand strategies team and wrote Reddit's brand engagement playbook. And Joe is here to discuss why people act differently in various online environments through his presentation, The Hidden Psychology of Social Networks. I've actually had the pleasure of watching him on stage. You guys are in for a treat, so I'm excited that. And then we have two of our special guests. I will introduce them later on, but we have Armando and Julia, who are going to join us after about the 15-minute presentation to add some lights to really where this conversation goes, not only on the psychology of engagement, but where we move forward from here. So with that, I will turn it over to Joe. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very excited to be here with everybody. Like Brian mentioned, I recently left my position as Reddit's head of brand strategy to pursue a book project, which will come out next year by the title of the presentation you see in front of you, The Hidden Psychology of Social Networks. So I want to start the presentation today by talking a little bit about the challenges that I faced in that role and how I feel like those challenges kind of are indicative of much of what we're facing as a kind of a marketing industry today. So what you're seeing right here is a visualization of a few, I think this is about 5,000 of the 100,000 individual communities that exist on Reddit. It's over 100,000 individual communities, all based around different interests and topics, everything from finance to cute animals to interesting fashion to politics are debated on the Reddit platform. And as I started in this role of head of brand strategy at Reddit, I was really wrestling with this challenge of what do I say to a brand who's trying to figure out how they approach such a diverse network like this. And like I said, I think this is actually something that we're dealing with as a marketing industry generally. Like I mentioned, there's over 100,000 communities on Reddit alone. There are over 180 different social networks that are active today. So as marketers, I think we're in this really difficult and challenging space of needing to customize ourselves and needing to customize our content and our voice and our editorial to these various different channels, but we need to do so in a way that allows us to scale and that enables us to kind of move in this kind of fluid world of digital and social. So as I've reflected on kind of my experience, both with Reddit and in kind of leading social, creative, and strategy teams at major agencies, this is kind of the diagram that I think kind of gets to the heart of where I start when it comes to kind of identifying a good social and digital strategy. On one side of the diagram here, we have brand behaviors that stand out and draw attention. And obviously, when we're advertising, we have to grab people's attention. When we're doing that in a feed that is social, it's more competitive than any channel that we've ever had to kind of interact in as advertisers. But when we err too far on that side of the spectrum, we end up in this place of disruption and hijacking. And I think, if we're honest with ourselves, those are not the words that we want to be associated with our interactions as a brand with people out in the world. On the other side of the diagram here are these brand behaviors that integrate naturally into the environment. And that's super important for us. I think most of us have kind of figured out that the first step to any good social engagement strategy has to start with listening. But sometimes we conform a little bit too much to what it feels like to be a user, and we take on behaviors that users take on and that might actually kind of detract from us gaining attention, because the average user in a social network isn't really getting as much reach as we hope to get. So the center of that Venn diagram, I think, is this space where we figure out how to add value. And I think this is something that is probably in every listicle of how to do social media right that's ever been written, but it's a nuanced thing and it's hard to do right. So I want to go through a couple of examples of brands that I think have really nailed this in the environment where they're interacting. The Madewell brand is one that I look to as an absolute best in class when it comes to influencer integrations and in Instagram strategy generally. When you look through the Madewell kind of brand presence on Instagram, you find that influencers make up a good portion of the content within their kind of curation set. They also license this out. They kind of leverage their brand out and allow influencers to post on their behalf, right? So they're then accumulating that kind of clout from the influencer's audience that they've built up naturally. But they do so in a way that feels really organic. They, rather than giving an influencer copy to post and saying like, here, make sure you include this key brand message, they offer up a prompt to their influencers and they say, here's an open-ended question. Tell us what you think about this, and merge our kind of visual styling and the product that we want to talk about with how you kind of editorialize yourself and how you speak to your audience. And then they have this extra layer of influencer integration that I think is particularly brilliant, in that they have their influencers, the ones that they pay, kind of attach these hashtags to their content, which is an obvious kind of play on a place like Instagram. But what it does is it allows people who buy their clothes to post right alongside the people who they look to as role models. So when some influencer that I really like posts an outfit by Madewell, and then I go and buy that outfit, I can post that outfit myself too, and it allows me to kind of insert myself into this almost influencer space. And I think on Instagram, that's a little bit of what we all want. Facebook, I think is a subtly different, but it requires a different kind of mindset. So this is a campaign that I worked on at BBDO. The Ziploc brand is a really interesting one. It's one that is not super obvious when it comes to social. How do you talk about plastic bags in an interesting way? And where the brand, had traditionally been in kind of a television mindset of, let's show you a bag test that kind of shows you why the Ziploc brand seal is better than the non-Ziploc brand seal. We found that wasn't making for super engaging content in social. So what I like to say that we did is we moved away from why Ziploc is the best product, and we started talking about how you can best use Ziploc. And what happened was we ended up in this place where we were creating life hacks, we were creating recipes that used the bags. We were showing you these all kinds of interesting and novel ways to put your Ziploc bag to use in a way that you probably hadn't thought of before. And that's great. Like, I think this is type of content that would succeed in digital generally, but it works particularly well on Facebook because as soon as this hits my feed, it's really obvious to me how I could start a conversation with my friends about DIY tie-dye crayons or Halloween bark or these seasonal recipes or life hacks using these plastic bags. It's easy to see how Ziploc became a conduit between friend connections within this space. And you can see the share numbers on these posts kind of tell that story. They were massively shared within the Facebook environment. And then obviously, having come from my role as a head of brand strategy at Reddit, I had to include a Reddit example here. There are a lot of examples of Reddit campaigns that are probably obvious ones, like Marvel superhero movies or other kinds of entertainment places where you look at Reddit and say like obvious fit. I wanted to pick a little bit more challenging one for us today. So I want to talk about the Charles Schwab brand and how they've engaged Redditors on the platform in a really interesting way. The Schwab brand recognized that Reddit is a really unique space in that because people are by default anonymous, they feel much more comfortable kind of expressing themselves and kind of exploring these topics that are otherwise taboo. Even things like personal finance are really well represented topics within the Reddit environment. People are willing to say things like, hey, I'm in deep debt and I don't really know what to do, or I don't really even know where to start when it comes to investing advice. There's even posts, and we see these every like couple of years or so, that someone comes on and says, I just won the lottery, but I don't know what to do with this money, and I don't want to tell my Facebook friends because I think they're going to look at me differently. So there's this kind of ethos of candidness within the Reddit environment that Charles Schwab looked and said, like, that's a really interesting and unique conversation that we can have with people that we can't in other online spaces. So we worked with the Charles Schwab brand to create a series of prompts like these. The Schwab kind of creative platform is Own Your Tomorrow. One of the prompts that we asked Redditors was, what's something you're doing today to set yourself up for success tomorrow? And we encourage people to tell us about all aspects of their life. Are you doing yoga? Are you exercising more? Are you saving for your kids' college fund? And we got this great set of kind of conversation going around what it means to own your tomorrow and to do better for your tomorrow, and gave the Schwab brand this really nice way to kind of enter itself into conversation in a space that was curated by them and that was safe for a brand to engage in. So hopefully, in looking back through those examples, it's obvious that they were adding value. But given this problem of there being so many different online spaces and so many different psychological contexts for us to interact with people in, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, how do we know what's going to add value? And I think the answer actually comes from this guy, Sigmund Freud, obviously. Freud is one of these thinkers who, the world before Sigmund Freud was different than the world after Sigmund Freud. So many of his ideas have become so integral in the way that we think about ourselves and our society that often when we study Freud today, we're only left with those kind of the last remaining kind of errors of his theories. Freud, and I want to focus on a particular work of his called Civilization and Its Discontents, where he coins this model of the id, the ego, and the superego, which I think emerges in a really interesting way in social media. Freud, I know, has some probably less than PC beliefs and teachings out there, so I did my best to kind of update him for a 2019 context. This is what I came up with. Pause for bad joke. So very briefly, the way that kind of Freud conceptualized the structure of the mind, this id, ego, superego structure, it works like this. So that we're born as id. When we're babies, we exist exclusively as id. This is where our initial kind of desires and drives come from. It's where our initial expressions come from. And the other parts of the mind kind of grow out of this. So as the id desires reach the kind of crust of the real world and face the limitations that the real world imposes on us, the ego forms as this conscious center of action. This is the space that mediates between the desires of the id and the limitations of the real world. And then the superego forms as this kind of final crust on top of everything else. These are the culturally learned rules. This is where our conscience lives and our ideal self. So we have this vision of what we would be if we were to live up to our ideal selves. And then the conscience kind of mediates between the ego and the superego to say, is our conscious center of action living up to what we kind of ideally look at ourselves at what we could possibly be? So here's how I think this kind of emerges from the social media environment. And I think this is it gives us some license to customize our content and our editorial voice to these types of channels without getting sucked down into the problem of having to kind of develop a separate strategy and structure for every different social media platform we want to engage in. So when we're in a platform like Facebook and Snapchat, we're only connected to our real life friends, right? So we have this kind of curated self that we're posting about, that we make sure that all of the content we engage with is content that we feel safe kind of talking about and wearing as a badge to the friends that we know. The types of content that work particularly well in those environments are ones that help me foster deeper connections and more connections with the friends that I'm connected to in this space. In Twitter or an Instagram, we may have a lot of the same friend connections that we do on Facebook, but because we have this ability to kind of reach outside of ourselves, to be discoverable through the hashtags that we use, for people to come and find our content, we put on a little bit more idealized self in this space. Like we filter our photos a little bit more, right? Then when we get down to platforms like Reddit, and there are lots of anonymous, interest-based communities online. I think Reddit just happens to be the best example and the largest accumulation of anonymous online communities. We get this interesting new psychological space where, one, we're not connected to our offline identity. So we get this ability to explore new interests and to express ourselves in ways that feel vulnerable elsewhere. But we also are organized around our ideas and our interests. So we're organized around these commonalities of psychographic as opposed to the happenstance of demographic and the connections that we happen to have. So when you look back at the three examples, and I know I'm running up on time here, when you look back at the 3 examples that I showed, hopefully that pattern is kind of reinforced. So you look at Ziploc sharing life hacks and recipes that are easy for a young millennial mom who was our target audience to connect with her friends and to share this information and these interesting kind of insights. You look at Madewell and their ability to kind of uplift their audience into this space of influencer. And then you look at Charles Schwab and their ability to kind of foster these candid relationships that are valuable to Redditors and that clearly add value in the space. And that's all I've got. We'll skip the key takeaways.
All right, thank you, Joe. There's plenty of key takeaways I think everyone was getting in there. I love the diving deep on the psychology of not only how marketers create engagement, but like where we go from there. And for those that are watching and listening, make sure you are using the hashtag Global Marketing Day on any of the social channels. Bring in your questions you might have from the presentation, or our 2 panelists, who I will go ahead and introduce now. And we'll kind of take some of the questions you have. I have a couple questions just based on what we have to start with. And first off is Julia. Julia Zhang is the head of growth at Himalaya. Julia is good with numbers, but also full of ideas and creativity. And she has a track record of not only driving growth initiatives, but also results with cross-functional teams. And then next to her, we have Armando. I'm going to mess up the name. I already told him I was going to mess up the last name. Bandi? Is that? Oh, I messed it up. Almost. He's the Chief Growth Officer at MailUp Group, a marketing technology company publicly traded on the Italian stock market, generating about $65 million in revenue and employing around 250 people. And as a last name Fanzo, I should be able to pronounce an Italian last name. So that's even like two things that my poor dad, if he was watching, he doesn't really do the internet. But my dad would be extremely disappointed in that pronunciation. But when we move from like the conversation that we were having here, where Joe set up this idea of psychology and where things are going. Julia, I'll kind of let you jump in first. When we're thinking about optimizing social media channels, especially for marketers, we're all in business. That's what we're using these channels for. What would you think, or what's the strategy or advice that you would give for people to reach their audiences most effectively, especially on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Joe gave a really good start as like how we can leverage the psychology to separate and segment your social media strategies accordingly. There's not really like a one template for all. Like it's in the ideal world, we all want to repurpose like the content for our Twitter, for Reddit, for Facebook, but based on the experiences and the cases I've seen, it's just not going to work. And I think based on the psychology drivers Joe just described, which is a brilliant piece, I would say. I think the value, the value and the entire strategy needs to be like customized accordingly. So, for example, like Facebook and maybe it's Snapchat, which is social media platforms that are based on your real identities. People potentially care about, for example, first vanity, second their like social reputation, and third kind of herd mentality. You want to do what your friends are doing as well. So these 3 can be the main like social psychology drivers for such platforms. Whereas for Reddit or Twitter, where you can potentially hide your real identity, the value or the core piece you want to deliver to the users to get the action started need to be more upfront. So I think that based on the Charles Schwab example on Reddit, you just need to deliver the most solid, the most valuable piece to prove yourself, because your value doesn't rely on your real identity anymore. It needs to be hooked to that one single piece you deliver through your social media strategy. So that would be my recommendations for the overall social.
What say you, Armando?
It's interesting. I was thinking that one of the things that are different today compared to a few years ago even is that audiences are more accessible than ever. Acquisition channels are more efficient than ever. Also, your customer base is the biggest than it has ever been, right? So one thing that always is very effective in thinking about how to be, effective is to be specific. And so to tailor, it's not as much what you care about, it's more about what your audience cares about and what makes them think and think and tick and kind of react in a positive way with your message. And then what you're selling is kind of a consequence to that, or a medium to that, or a way in which they represent that they feel that they affiliate with your thinking and your message. But it's really around the story that you tell, around the things that they care about, as we were saying.
So I love that, and thank you everyone for kind of bringing in your questions. I do see the questions that are coming in here. And Armando, I'm going to kick this one back to you. Victor, on the watching the live stream, you talked a little bit about having that focus, and I love that you put the focus on what the customers want, not what we as marketers want, which is what we forget. But his question comes down to: does my brand have to keep the same brand voice across all social media channels? What's your take on that brand voice piece? Because it's a very delicate balance. What the answer would have been 3 years ago is probably a little different than what it is today.
It is a very delicate balance. Piggybacking on what you were saying just about now, it has to be a consistent voice. It doesn't have to be the same exact voice, right? So he has to feel authentic. He has to be true to what you stand for, but then he also has to kind of tailor on what is the medium, what is the channel. That would be my recommendation.
What about you, Julia? What are your thoughts there on that brand voice? There was also kind of the idea that says, how do I build trust if I'm conveying different messages on different platforms? And I think part of it is that authenticity. I think authenticity isn't about the message as much as it is the actual authenticity of the message. But how do you think of that from a cross-channel perspective?
So when I think about this consistent brand image, I would use a parallel of personality. We all are personal individuals, but we appear in different environments and context. So at a family party, at a school reunion, at for example, going on a date, you will be showing very different personality. So when thinking about keeping that common piece as a common thread, you can always think, okay, if your brand image or your brand is a personality, how do you keep that genuine image consistent throughout the different contexts? I think the core value is that the core message is that it can be consistent, but it can be phrased into a different way and different format. For example, on Twitter, you just gotta make it short and sweet, make it witty. For Reddit, you just gotta use all the slangs and the Reddit jargon, like LPT and etc. And whereas on Instagram, you just need to make it colorful and very friendly for image. So that would be my take on that topic.
No, I think it's interesting too. TikTok, it's FYP, and you're I was what is this coming from? I was we're adding new. We already have enough in that space. I know Pia Day here on submitted one of the questions about really thinking about brand behavior, and you brought up. I love it. Joe brought up the anonymity of Reddit, the idea that you can ask questions that might not ask. But let's also face it, the anonymity also allows people to make comments, negative comments, and say things without the feeling of repercussions. Those traditional keyboard warriors. I'm curious, Armando, with dealing with negative comments or negative information coming in on social media. What was your strategy? How did you look at that kind of content?
Well, generally speaking, you want to react to those comments. You don't want to let them go by. You also want to kind of react in a positive way. It is a delicate balance, and you see many examples of brands getting that wrong and not doing the best possible job or managing the situation the best possible way. I don't know if I have a listicle of things, but generally speaking, you want to be reactive. You want to be on the spot, on the topic, and kind of manage.
What are your thoughts on the negative comments, Julia?
Yeah, we've actually had a lot of situations since we run a mobile app, and there's always negative reviews, not only on social, but for example on App Store as well. So I think we usually take different approaches. For the obvious troll, we either neglect it, because if you take it seriously, you're really not making anyone look pretty. But for some other genuine concerns or good suggestions from critical comments from critics and comments from other from the users, then we would take it as seriously as them as well. So for example, if there's a suggestion for features, if there's a concern about the product safety issues or privacy issues, we'll definitely address it in a more serious matter. So I think it really depends on what's the negative message about, and you should take it smartly and use it in your advantage.
And I love this conversation, not only around the comments and conversation, but the psychology there, right? We have to understand a lot of times people are just commenting and saying those things. They want to be acknowledged. It has a lot less to do with a lot of those other pieces that we sometimes get our head around. We also worry way too much on the negative comments and not enough on the positive comments. But that's probably a whole nother hour of fun conversation that you guys have. So I want to thank all three of you. Joe from Reddit, Armando from MailUp, who I will not try the last name again, and Julia from Himalaya. Thank you guys so much for some really great lessons, not only that for brands to take away on expanding on Reddit, but really taking social media strategy and understand that psychology. I believe the world needs more empathy, and it starts with the idea of thinking social media at a different level and understanding these different online environments. If you guys are out there on social media, make sure you guys share what we're doing here, not only using the hashtag on Twitter and all of the other channels, including making some comments there on Reddit, and we talked Quora on the previous conversation, but join the conversation, be part of what we have going on here, and we will be back to you guys shortly with more content, more conversations. I mean, we're hitting that 20-hour mark, so stay tuned.